During the 19th century, many philosophers and thinkers gradually came to realize that the scientific method could not tackle some of the most fundamental aspects of what we usually call lived experience. This became a central concern for many of them, especially in the humanities, and for a long time. Arguably to this day, we seem to remain stuck with this issue, unsure whether society or language are subjective constructs or objective powers. But it was more than a century ago, in 1907, that Henri Bergson formulated a very famous thought experiment related to this problem. He said, "If I want to mix a glass of sugar and water, I must willy-nilly wait until the sugar melts. This little fact is big with meaning. For here, the time I have to wait is not that mathematical time, which would apply equally well to the entire history of the material world. It coincides with my impatience, that is to say, with a certain portion of my own duration, which I cannot protract or contract as I like. It is no longer something thought, it is something lived." Bergson is making the point that when we are confronted with lived experience, even with something as anodyne as a sugar melting in water, we find that science's explanatory power reaches its limits. The impatience that I feel is not related in any way to the material that changes in the glass. As he says, the scientific method becomes less and less subjective, more and more symbolical, that is to say, abstract. Bergson sought a formulation that would allow us to tackle lived experience, and in so doing he contributed to make this one of the most important problems in 20th century thought. There is little doubt that Deleuze was very aware of this problem. In fact, I would be inclined to say that it's probably one of the most important aspects of his own philosophy. It's an aspect that is deeply problematical, even paradoxical, because how do we make a theory of the concrete? How do we abstractly represent what is by definition not abstract and not representable? In order to answer this question, Deleuze may have looked at his other great philosophical inspiration, or master, the greatest prophet of modernity, Nietzsche. In the 1880s, at the peak of his philosophical maturity, Nietzsche wrote this: "My theory would be the following, that the will to power is the primitive form of affect, all other affects being only its elaboration." Nietzsche uses this word, affect, which has a long history in philosophy, but he puts it in a place of prominence in his own thought. Perhaps this is why he saw in Spinoza his own predecessor. Consider, for example, what Nietzsche says about Spinoza. "I am utterly amazed, utterly enchanted. I have a precursor, and what a precursor! I hardly knew Spinoza. That I should have turned to him just now was inspired by instinct. Not only is his over-tendency like mine, namely to make all knowledge the most powerful affect, but in 5 main points of his doctrine I recognize myself." To make all knowledge the most powerful affect, what a strange thing to say. That really makes you wonder what there is behind this concept. Is it mere luck that 3 out of 3 of Deleuze's main philosophical influences were directly concerned with the issue of lived experience and affect? Well, probably not. But for us, the question would be what Deleuze actually made of this problem, and there are many possible answers. But there is one text in particular, which is called Spinoza and the Three Ethics, which is particularly interesting because it formulates the problem of affect in terms of levels of knowledge, and it turns upside down the usual concept of affect. Consider the following quote, for example, where he distinguishes 3 aspects, or 3 possible readings, if you will, of Spinoza's most famous book, the Ethics. "The ethics of the definitions, axioms and postulates, demonstrations and corollaries, is a river book that develops its course. But the ethics of the Scholia is a subterranean book of fire. The ethics of Book 5 is an aerial book of light, which proceeds by flashes. A logic of the sign, a logic of the concept, a logic of essence. Shadow, color, light. Each of the 3 ethics coexists with the others and is taken up in the others, despite their differences in kind." Deleuze is making a technical point here. He is referring to Spinoza's geometric method. The ethics is structured around definitions, axioms, etc., and Spinoza seems to navigate the serene currents of reason with calm deliberation. But as Deleuze observes, the text is often interrupted by these strange passages called scholia, which literally means study, in which Spinoza writes more openly, polemically even at times. These passages do not belong to the flowing element of water, but to fire, as Deleuze says, because of their interruptive nature which challenges the good order of the text. And finally, there is Book 5 of the Ethics, which commentators of Spinoza have often said was unfinished because it proceeds at a completely different pace than the other books. Here, the demonstrations are abrupt. It seems that thought is liberated from any constraints and goes at an infinite speed, as Deleuze says. The demonstrations are sublimated, as it were. Water is transformed by fire into air, meaning that thought reaches its final form, its own element, liberated from all constraints. Spinoza seems not only to tell us, but to show us what bliss consists of, what the highest level of reason really is. And it is probably for this reason that Deleuze gets so interested in the ethics. The three levels of the ethics, the three levels of knowledge, ultimately pertain to a genetic definition of the affect. In commenting Spinoza in this manner, is Deleuze trying to show us something fundamental about affects? Lived experience cannot, as Bergson says, be apprehended by normal scientific or representative methods without becoming what it is not, that is, abstract. So how can we even speak about affect? In this video we will see how Deleuze shows what lived philosophy is. In particular, what is this mysterious realm beyond the geometric method that characterizes Book 5? Now, in order to go beyond the geometric method, we first need to understand it. My current favorite way to learn about math and logic is with the app called Brilliant. I'm very proud to say that Brilliant is a sponsor of this video. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. What sets Brilliant apart is their unique approach to learning. Instead of passive watching, you're actively solving problems in visual ways and building understanding from the ground up. This hands-on method has been proven to be 6 times more effective than traditional lecture videos. What I love about Brilliant is how it helps you break down complex problems in visual ways. It also helps you develop a powerful daily learning habit. In just minutes a day, you can build real knowledge and sharpen your problem-solving skills. It's the perfect way to level up your math and logic game, whether you're a beginner or looking to tackle advanced concepts. Right now, Brilliant is offering you a very special deal. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Plus, you will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Just visit the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. In Spinoza and the Three Ethics, Deleuze identifies 3 types of knowledge: signs or affects, notions or concepts, and essences or percepts. Signs and affects form what he calls inadequate knowledge, while concepts and percepts are adequate knowledge. The distinction between adequacy and inadequacy depends on how knowledge is acquired. It can be acquired either passively through random encounters, when we merely react to external stimuli, but as Deleuze explains, such signs can have multiple meanings, and they are only effects. That is, the trace of one body upon another, the state of a body, as it suffers the action of another body. At this first level of knowledge, all I understand is the effect that another body has on me, without learning anything about that other body itself. I know only whether it feels good or bad. For instance, if I stand in the sun, I know I feel warm, but I don't know anything about the sun or why I feel warm. As Spinoza points out, I might just as well imagine that the sun is 200 feet away. This is inadequate knowledge, which is essentially a very limited awareness defined by the current state of my body. Deleuze, following Spinoza, calls this an affection, from the Latin affectio. The signs at this level are called scala, referring to extensive quantities, meaning that they simply reflect what appears to be, with all the possible errors that this can lead to. To reach adequate knowledge, some form of correction is needed. But how is that possible when all I know at this point are the momentary states of my body as indicated by the passions that I receive? Well, if you're lying down in the sun, it might be that after a while you notice you've become too warm. In other words, you have experienced a transition from one state to another. This passage between quantities is itself a sign, an affect in the proper sense. As Deleuze says, affection is therefore not only the instantaneous effect of a body upon my own, but also has an effect on my own duration, a pleasure or pain, a joy or sadness. These are passages, becomings, rises and falls, continuous variations of power that pass from one state to another. We will call them affects, strictly speaking, and no longer affections. They are signs of increase and decrease, signs that are vectorial, of the joy-sadness type, and no longer scalar, like the affections, sensations, or perceptions. So affections signal states, while affects signal changes. In both cases, all I know is that something affects my body, and it doesn't really matter whether what affects my body is a material object or an ideal object, like language. In fact, Deleuze explains that most of our inadequate knowledge comes from language itself. For example, he distinguishes between four main types of scalar sign: indicative, abstractive, imperative, and interpretative, and two primary types of affects, joy and sadness, along with potentially ambiguous affects, as Deleuze suggests. All of these signs are part of inadequate knowledge because they only tell me something about myself, about traces, about a change. However that may be, with affects something new emerges. I can now experience a change rather than just a state. This shift gives me a bit more information about the world. I'm not just locked into static reactions, but I discern changes between these reactions. It is true that affects depend on affections, and Deleuze certainly says as much when he says that affects always presuppose the affections from which they are derived, although they cannot be reduced to them. But it's also true that with affects I have knowledge of variations of power in my body, which is to say that I become aware of what is good and what is bad for me. For example, I know that staying a moment in the sun is good, it increases my power, but after a while it decreases it. So as inadequate as my experience can be, it allows me to acquire a very tiny amount of knowledge of a very particular thing. And this is where the second level of knowledge begins. The second type of knowledge corresponds to the second aspect of Spinoza's ethics. Here, something very new emerges and knowledge changes completely. Whereas at the first level I only had knowledge of myself, of my passions, at this second level I acquire conceptual knowledge, or as Deleuze says following Spinoza, common notions, whose characteristic trait is that they are active, or activating. Signs or affects are inadequate ideas and passions. Common notions or concepts are adequate ideas from which true actions ensue. This true action results in the construction of adequate knowledge. As Deleuze says, this knowledge is structural. It's about what something is made of. In a certain sense, it's a step beyond the surface of the thing towards the interiority or the depth of the thing. He says, light is no longer reflected or absorbed by bodies that produces shadows. It makes bodies transparent by revealing their intimate structure, in Latin fabrica. This is the second aspect of light. The intellect is the true apprehension of the structures of the body, whereas the imagination merely grasps the shadow of one body upon another. Here again it is a question of optics, but it is now an optical geometry. Here every structure or object is composed of other bodies and composes other bodies. Common notions are universal in this sense, but they are more or less so, depending on whether I know the structure of just one body or of all possible bodies, such as the structure of space, movement and rest, etc. Which is to say that common notions really occur within a spectrum. This new type of knowledge leads to a new way of life. Whereas before, the chain of encounters was random and associative, as Deleuze says, now it is automatic, meaning that the manner in which my knowledge evolves is subject to rules, and these are the rules of structures. It is in this sense that the second level of knowledge refers to the geometric method. But how do we effectuate the jump from the world of shadows to the world of geometry, or as Deleuze says, colors? It would seem that that's impossible, because how can something inadequate produce something adequate? The answer is that common notions appear after I reach a certain level of power, which gives me knowledge of the structure of just one object, and it then evolves into knowledge of the most general objects, which Spinoza calls the attributes, and of which we know only two, thought and extension. As Deleuze says, from a random encounter of bodies, we can select the idea of those bodies that agree with our own and give us joy, that is, that increase our power. And it is only when our power is sufficiently increased, to a point that undoubtedly varies with each case, that we come into possession of this power and become capable of forming a concept, beginning with the least universal concept, the agreement of our body with one other. even if we subsequently attain even larger concepts following the order of the composition of relations. There is thus a selection of the passional affects and of the ideas on which they depend, which must liberate joys, vectorial signs of the augmentation of power, and ward off sadnesses, signs of diminution. This is to say that at the second level we have come into possession of the means to select affects of joy. In other words, because affects of joy increase my power to act, I have become able to discern, with ever increasing refinement, the affects that are good and reject those that are bad. This is to say that I have created a feedback loop which organizes joyful affects with each other in this automatic chain mentioned earlier. This line, which now separates the outside world of random encounters from a more organized world, the world of thought, the world of the subject. Of course, you may say that the subject was already there on the first level, and it's true. But the difference is that now it has become active, precisely because of this feedback loop. If you recall, in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze actually calls the nascent subjectivity of the first level the larval subjects, precisely because they have not hatched yet. So this active selection that we become able to do is the condition for leaving the first type of knowledge. But this is not to say that we are not affected anymore. Very much the opposite, in fact. Common notions are affects, but they are affects of a different kind. As Deleuze explains, passions never really disappear, but rather they double the common notions. They will subsist, they will double the notions, but will lose their exclusive or tyrannical character to the profit of notions and actions. So to the first definition of affect, which was simply the lived effect of an affection, we now have a second definition. The affect is something that can select the joys and help me increase my power to act, also while eliminating sad passions that diminish my power to act. Now common notions produce adequate knowledge through this selection, but we should not be led to think that this is an easy process. There are many ways to get things wrong and to select things that we believe are good for us and that are in fact very bad. And Deleuze warns us as follows. The selection of signs or affects as the primary condition for the birth of the concept does not merely imply the personal effort each person must take on his or her own behalf, reason, but a passional struggle, an inexpiable affective combat in which one risks death, in which signs confront signs and affects clash with affects in order that a little joy might be saved that could make us leave the shadow and change kind. The cries of the language of signs are the mark of this battle of the passions, of joys and sadnesses, of increases and decreases of power. The difficulty is that at this second level of knowledge, concepts and affects always interrupt each other, as if they were at war. And this is not just a theory, but according to Deleuze, it's something that Spinoza tries to show us concretely in the text, hence the three aspects or the three readings of the ethics. As he says, if the scholia are inserted into the demonstrative chain, it is therefore less because they form a part of it than because they intersect and re-intersect with it, by virtue of their own nature. It is like a broken chain, discontinuous, subterranean, volcanic, which at irregular intervals comes to interrupt the chain of demonstrative elements, the great and continuous fluvial chain. Each scholium is like a lighthouse that exchanges its signals with the others, at a distance and across the flow of the demonstrations. It is like a language of fire that is distinguishable from the language of the waters. How should we understand this? What does this mean, really, that there are two chains interrupting each other? Well, we have seen that knowledge of the first kind is really about my body, while knowledge of the second kind is about concepts. The fact that they mutually interrupt each other means that out of these two series, a third one appears, in which, so to speak, concepts become sensual, and the senses become reflexive. Shadows and colors mix with each other. Determinism and indeterminism mingle to produce a new dimension, a new kind of knowledge. The punctual dimension of affection and the dual dimension of the concept add up quite literally in order to produce a volumetric dimension, a 3D of the concept where pure light is liberated. Deleuze says this is the third element of Spinoza's logic. No longer signs or affects, nor concepts, but essences or singularities, percepts. It is the third state of light, no longer signs of shadow, nor of light as color, but light in itself and for itself. On the third level of knowledge, identified by Spinoza, which he calls active contemplation, eternal essences are formed, and they create a new mental space, new possibilities for thought. Here, thought is so completely liberated that it operates at an infinite speed. As Deleuze says, essences are pure figures of light. They are in themselves contemplations, that is to say, they contemplate as much as they are contemplated, in the unity of God. The subject or the object percepts. The common notions refer to relations of movement and rest that constitute relative speeds. Essences, on the contrary, are absolute speeds that do not compose space by projection, but occupy it all at once, in a single stroke. These are nonetheless the two characteristics of essences: absolute and no longer relative speed, figures of light and no longer geometric figures revealed by light. This is what makes Book 5 of the Ethics so special. The geometric method of Book 5 is a method of invention that will proceed by intervals and leaps, hiatuses and contractions, somewhat like a dog searching rather than a reasonable man explaining. What Deleuze is describing here is yet a third sense of the word affect. In this third sense, affect is something that makes a life. It's something that becomes a truth in itself, quite literally, something that is actively produced as well as passively felt, and actually felt as it is produced. It's as if there was no more distance between cause and effect. This point is quite vital for Deleuze, and he says, if, as Blanchot says, books have as their correlate the absence of the book, or a more secret book made of flesh and blood, Book 5 would be this absence or this secret in which signs and concepts vanish, and things begin to write by themselves and for themselves, crossing the intervals of space. So active contemplation is the place where our thought reaches this level, which is perhaps best known to artists, when every action seems to be both willed and automatic, created through us rather than by us. It's a state of creation where something new happens that has never been seen before. So Book 5, with its leaps and hiatuses, is not incomplete, but rather it manifests this new power. The function of the interval or hiatus is to bring together to the maximum degree terms that are distant as such, and thereby to assure a speed of absolute survey. Speeds can be absolute and yet have a greater or lesser magnitude. The particular characteristics of Book 5, the way it surpasses the method of the preceding books, always comes down to this: the absolute speed of figures of light. It is so interesting to see how Deleuze deploys two registers, so to speak. Not only is there two languages of water and fire, but there is the spatial register, which sees singular problematic points turn into automatic chains of common notions, and ultimately into three-dimensional figures. There is a great unfolding. And then there is the register, which appears to be more ideational, where Deleuze distinguishes shadows, colors, and light. What these two registers have in common is the manner in which the affect differentiates itself within them, as if it was the rule, and thought and extension were the models of realization. From inadequate to adequate, it's an active contemplation of the world, not just an abstract idea about myself or about objects anymore. So how does all of this solve the problem that we identified at first of immediate knowledge and lived experience? Following Spinoza, Deleuze shows us how the third type of knowledge emerges out of the process of selection that is developed in common notions. In this sense, not only do we get to contemplate essences, but we also get to create them. And finally, we also let them change us. Lived experience is not, therefore, something that I feel passively. It's not about my private experience. It's not something that I experience as a subject, but I think Deleuze is telling us that in fact it's the opposite. Lived experience, or the affect in its most developed sense, is the propitious act of creation. It's the ideas, the myths, the novelties that we create, the truths that we come up with, and that allow us to reach this something more profound that imagination knew of all time but perhaps could not formulate on its own, and that reason finds again in the act of creation. What could make affect one of the most important concepts in Deleuze is precisely this ability that it has to endure as the sensual side of the concept and then produce a conceptual aspect of sensation. To my knowledge, there is only one book in which affects are not mentioned, and that is the book on Proust and signs. Perhaps the reason for this is that signs are, as we have seen, synonymous with affects in the most basic sense. I want to send a heartfelt thank you to my amazing patrons for their unwavering support. Your contribution makes a huge difference, and it's truly thanks to each of you that this channel continues to thrive and grow. So thank you very much for being part of this journey. And thanks to all of you for watching, and see you soon.